Marshall is an economist at the University of Utah. He's a fellow at the Jain Family Institute. I'd say if you have a Twitter account, he's overall just a very, very smart guy who has a lot of interesting insights, mostly about like economics, some about higher education, but it's anyway, somebody who I've enjoyed following and reading. So, Marshall, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. That's a very flattering introduction.
And so what I want to get into today is you co-wrote a sort of a memo, a proposal. It's like 70 pages long, so I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. Anyway, it's co-written by you and a fellow named Andrew Elrod, and it's a look at what higher education policies should be. The title is "Rebuilding American Higher Education: From an Engine of Inequality to a Pillar of the Public Interest." And the reason I was so interested in this is that because we are having a higher education discourse basically in which the Republican Party, the Trump administration is basically very opposed to college higher education as we know it. It's too liberal, it's too woke, it's whatever the words they use are. But if you listen carefully, a lot of their criticisms are shared by a lot of what I would call centrist Democrats for now. Like in more polite language, they say colleges are wrong and colleges are too elite and colleges are too radical and so on. And you, of course, saw the repression on campuses that happened when Joe Biden was president. So I think there is a critique of higher education on the right, and there's a critique on the center left that are like different versions of the same thing. And I think what you brought is a different critique of higher education with some different solutions. So I want to start there. Uh, in your view, what are the kind of the main problems of American higher education?
So I think all comes down to the phrase institutional stratification and segregation, and that is on all sorts of dimensions like income and wealth, as well as race and ethnicity and nativity for that matter. Basically, what we have now in this country is a higher education system that consists of heterogeneous institutions that each enroll homogeneous student bodies. And what was different in the past is we had at least a more egalitarian system where you had more homogeneous institutions relative to now enrolling a more heterogeneous student body. So in economics terms, I call that a pooling equilibrium that has collapsed to a separating equilibrium by means of cream skimming. That is to say, due to the privatization and plutocratic takeover of higher education, institutions are increasingly sort of trying to pick and choose their students for getting the maximum ability to pay so they can charge the highest tuition. For public institutions, that typically means trying to recruit, or I should say for public flagship institution, that means trying to recruit across state lines, enroll out-of-state students because they're worried about a budget model that relies too much on state appropriations. There have been some cuts, although I think the degree to which there's been austerity in higher education is actually somewhat overstated in the discourse. There's certainly been austerity in some sectors and some reaches of higher education, but it's really what is being funded as opposed to the amount of funding. And the institutions that we have are trying to kind of accommodate themselves to this world where there's less public funding available, or it's keyed to different programming that the institutions put together, and instead they're trying to kind of reach out and get the students that come with the dollars that they think will keep the doors open.
Let me
And that
break
means
down.
basically whereas there used to be a place in the public systems for a variety of different students, each of them able to access a high quality of education. Now it's more like where you start in life is it dictates the type of institution that you're going to have access to. And I think that's behind a lot of the public dissatisfaction and loss of trust in the higher education system that isn't articulated by the elites either of the right or of the center left as you described to begin with.
So, okay, let me to say this in super simple terms, community colleges and kind of non-flagships often enroll a lot of lower income students, a lot of students of color. You have this sort of flagships, sort of University of Michigan at the high end, but even like the University of Alabama, the sort of more elite state school public funded schools that are trying to enroll essentially higher income white, they tend to be whiter populations of students who can pay their way, and they even were recruiting out of state for them. Then you have the Harvards and Dartmouths, who of course are enrolling the very few students, but they're a very they talk about diversity a lot, but in reality they have a very homogeneous uh, population, particularly in terms of income, wealth, and their parents having gone to college. So you have, and there was a period before in America where a lot of colleges enrolled all three of those groups at once. That's kind of the critique you draw, right?
Yeah, that is a very good summary. I would say the one point that neither of us has made so far is the uh, re calibration, the re-engineering of the sort of mid-tier state school away from providing an academic education that's broadly applicable to a student population that is mostly in state, both in the past and in the present. They're not offering that anymore, and they have accommodated themselves to the world of plutocracy and privatized funding by converting solely to a sort of workplace training model. And I think that's especially important to highlight in the present discourse, where a lot of political elites are saying the problem with higher education is that it's not key to the real world enough, that you have woke professors teaching unimportant subjects to students that don't need that kind of an education in order to do the jobs that are actually available on the market. The fact is that is the way in which the higher education system has already been re-engineered. So this is why I say the kind of elite reaction to the current loss of trust seems to be more of the same. More of the same means disinvestment from academic programs serving a non-traditional population by means of the broadly accessible state four-year institution, and instead replacing that curriculum entirely with workplace training. And it doesn't even serve students' interests narrowly in the workplace. That's the point that I would make about this as a labor economist, which is, you think this is supposedly more relevant because it's teaching you the skills for the jobs that are actually available, but what it's actually doing is letting employers dictate the curriculum and transferring the cost of training for the jobs that those employers are offering from the employers themselves to the students in the form of tuition and student debt. So it's like they figured out how to transfer the job training to the students, and they dominate the curriculum, and that kind of ties students to being pre kind of dedicated to a given career and specifically a given employer. So, what I study from my work on labor economics is the dependence of workers on employers, and the coercive ability that confers on employers. Basically, I viewed this kind of erosion of the academic potential of the mid-tier state university as one mechanism by which employers exercise control over their workers. So teaching workers the curriculum that they need for the jobs of tomorrow, or whatever the buzzword is really tying workers to their future employers and eroding their ability to earn money in the labor market, because basically they don't have any broadly applicable skills, or fewer of them.
So to be a little bit more reductive again here on my end, at least, the political discourses, I do a lot of politics on the right, which you end up with, they're complaining about. Well, I guess again, are they both complaining about you in different ways? Like, and when I say you, if your work, you're for forgiving, you're for forgiving student debt, you're for a different economic system. Like when I listen to the Josh Shapiros and the sort of politicians complaining about higher education, what I think I'm hearing is Republicans don't like college professors at elite universities because those professors say things that that are too far to the left of them, and they want to make a different kind of economy that is less capitalist and so on. But I think that's actually the same thing is happening in the center left. Is like, if the professors who are too woke are like a very small number of people who have public platforms, but also have a lot of intelligent thoughts. And following your Twitter feed, I do get the sense that Joe Biden's White House staff probably did not love you and would probably love to say all college professors are like that guy, right? We have a class of people
Mhm.
who at a lot of colleges who are highly intelligent and who do not share the views of the elites of either party. This was actually going on here, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think what do that either the right or the center left think of me in particular as
Yeah, yeah, sure.
as
Yeah,
a professor with a public platform
right.
who articulates, I like to think, potent criticisms of their shared higher education policy consensus. I'll reserve judgment on that as to what they think of me. I do think that broadly both sets of constituents, their criticism is what they don't like about the higher education system is that it permits, relatively high prestige, relatively well remunerated employment to their critics. So
Mm,
definitely on the right, they think I should be disemployed basically on the basis of my ideology. On the center left, I would say as far as I have kind of interacted with this world, it's really not as much of an ideological critique, but more of a generational one. It's like,
mm,
basically we senior policy people or professors or however you want to conceive it have been trying to defend the higher education system from its critics for 30 years, way before you got here, you
mm,
young upstart. And the way that we've done that is by resting the value of the higher education system on the promise to increase individual earnings. So
right.
you labor economists doing new kind of, let's say, self-flattering, but I'll say groundbreaking work in labor economics, you're coming into the higher education system and saying, no, 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 you've got it all wrong. You've misinterpreted what the purpose of higher education is in the labor market. And they're like, that's not helpful. Like we had a
Right.
good defense of higher education going on the basis of its promise to increase individual earnings. And now you're coming in and saying it doesn't increase individual earnings. You're the problem because you're undermining the foundation on which the higher education system that we have defended has kind of reconstituted itself.
You made this point of elites versus the public. Why do you think the public is down higher? Because I think this is an interesting. Your theory is interesting. Why is the public? I think has much different concerns that
Yeah.
we're not. I think there's one cost is obvious. Is that cost is one concern that I think is there, has always been there. But what else is there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the elite consensus critique of higher education is to the in the nature of what we've already been discussing, that it is a bunch of overpaid, kind of confident professors that aren't doing anything that's really worthwhile for the
Right.
public. I think and crucially, what is true about the elite critique is that it doesn't center what I think is wrong with the higher education system, which is plutocracy. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
public's critique of the higher education system, to what I like to imagine myself more aligned with, is you know, this system used to be available to us. It used to be sort of part of the local fabric of the economy, both from, where I'm going to send my kid that offers an affordable higher education. So, that's where I want my kid to go, is the university that I've been paying tax dollars towards my whole life, and that they're going to, be living in the state too. And, that's kind of like part of what this local, geographically kind of demarcated society is about, is supporting this higher education edifice. So that's kind of been closed off by the withdrawal of state funding. I mean, what I articulate in the paper is what I view as this downward spiral where state governments that have been taken over by plutocrats serving legislators say, we're going to cut higher education. The state flagship institutions that have some ability to recruit out of state and
Mhm.
kind of do the University of Alabama model say, okay, fine, just basically deregulate us completely, make us, to all intents and purposes, not a state
Right.
institution. Will absorb the funding cut, or at least the funding reorganization, and we will, go out and recruit higher paying students from out of state. Just don't make us enroll too many students from in state, because what is wrong with the funding cuts is that, we needed that money in order to educate the students you wanted to educate. So if you're going to cut the funding, don't make us admit those students that are harder to educate, or whatever line the institutions would come up with. The state legislatures agree to that because their main priority these days is cutting taxes for rich people. And the institutions basically are no longer available to most of the state's population, other than maybe the children of the legislators themselves. Then next time the funding cycle rolls around, it's like the state legislature is like, well, why would we fund this? It's
Mhm.
basically a private institution at this point, and they can support themselves by going out of state or going into partnerships with local employers or whatever. It's like no longer our business.
Mm.
And I think that sort of downward spiral is bespeaks the alliance and the ideological consensus among the ruling class, kind of whatever nominal ideology you're talking about, and separates them, the higher education system and the plutocrats who run it, from the public that they're no longer serving. Where it's not. I mean, I don't imagine that the broad majority of the United States population shares my left-wing views, but I do think they want a higher education system that they think is affordable, that offers
Mhm.
a high-quality education to their children, and is part of the local economic fabric. And I view that as basically requiring a total, pretty radical reform to the higher education system that has come to exist over the last couple decades.
And now let's come to those reforms. I think they were very interesting to me. And okay, so the first one is direct federal institutional funding. So you want to
Mhm.
have colleges and universities funded by the federal government feels really weird right now, but even without Donald Trump, would feel challenging
Mhm.
instead of by the states. Unpack why that would be important.
So not instead of by the states. That is to say, we're
Sure.
talking about replacing. There's basically a three-legged stool in the current system. There's tuition, student tuition backstopped by federal loans. There's state appropriations, and there's federal research grants.
Right.
The federal research grants not only fund research, but there's overhead on top of that. So a big source of specifically the state flagships funding is that basically 50% overhead on top of any federal research grant. So that's the three big pots of money that exist in public higher education. What we propose is basically replacing the tuition pot with direct federal funding of the institutions. And in fact, we also propose replacing that overhead. So the federal funding would not be tied to research grants through
Mhm.
the research agencies. It would come directly as part of the federal government's education policy through the Department of Education's appropriations. That's basically the idea. Um, why
It
do
would
we
be
say
on
that?
top of state funding. So they would
So yeah,
so
we are definitely saying like the
yeah.
economics of the proposal rely on basically maintaining levels of state
Okay.
funding, which we'll get to because I don't think that we should take that as given by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, it's not replacing the state
Mhm.
appropriations. The economics works if they stay, if the state appropriations basically stay at the current level. So that's what we contemplate. Um, why go to institutional funding? Basically, that tuition leg of the stool that I just described is already federal funding, is our argument. That is to say, the federal government is originating $100 billion of new student loans every year, of which 70% of that principal value will never be repaid.
Mhm.
So it is already funding institutions through the indirect mechanism of backstopping their high tuition, and
Mhm.
then the students don't actually repay the loans.
Right.
And the institutions and the whole system likes it that way because it's basically no strings attached federal funding, because the mythology is the free market regulates institutions and the free market operates through students freely choosing which institution they're going to go to, and they're going to go to the one with the highest value. And if they're choosing wrong, we can help them choose right. So there's a lot of policy moves, like starting under the Obama administration, of people are making the wrong choice, so let's inform them about which institutions really are the high quality institutions, so that free market mechanism will operate more efficiently.
Right.
So I don't think the free market mechanism has any hope of operating efficiently. I don't think that this is similar in some ways to healthcare, where yes, it's extremely expensive, and if you make students pay the full tuition, that is to say, without backstopping with federal student loans, they'll definitely spend less on higher education and they'll cut back. But individuals are not very good at choosing high quality. Like, it's
Right.
not, no shade on individuals. It's just the type of market where the free market is never going to be an effective regulator. So you need someone who actually has an education policy and knows how the system works. In our ideal world, the federal Department of Education would play that role of a sector specific regulator. And they would say, yes, we are the paymasters. We're not going to do this backdoor thing through unrepayable student debt. We're
Mhm.
going to fund directly, and we're going to have, some pretty onerous strings attached. And that is exactly what the current crop of institutions is most afraid of, is those strings. That is to say, one big string would be you can't charge tuition, or so I'm not a doctrinaire free college guy. What I am is a doctrinaire uniform tuition guy. So I don't like different students paying different tuition, because to me that invites the institutions to try to basically pick and choose their student body
Right.
for the highest tuition
Mhm.
payers. So I'm saying, basically my version of the regulation would be low uniform tuition across applicants, backstopped by the federal institutional appropriations, and other regulations such as, no plutocrats on the board of trustees, no what I call credentializing master's programs. So another thing that institutions do is create these um, kind of professional degree programs that are very expensive, and they basically tell students like, okay, you need this in order to get a job, and it's sort of they're preying on students' career anxieties, kind of thing. That would be eliminated. So it's like we only let given that all of the degree programs that the institutions would be offering are operating under our imagined federal institutional appropriations, that gives the federal government direct power to say, you can't offer that program if it doesn't serve our aims. And those and the criteria that we're proposing is basically it has to be in the public interest, not in the interest of money making on the part of the institution.
So, okay, you said I'm not a reflexive free college guy. That struck
Yeah,
me that I didn't necessarily expect you to say that. But I guess the
yeah,
point being, you would not be for every college charging 100 grand per student. But your point is like, if there's some kind of uniform $5,000 of tuition a year,
Yeah,
and if you have to go into debt for that, we'll talk about how to do that, but sort of uniform policy.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty
I
right.
mean, the uniform is what's important and what is contrary to the status quo, where, one of the myths that we attack in the paper is the idea that charging different students different tuition is progressive because it redistributes from the rich students to the poor students. That's not how it actually works, is our argument in the paper. How it actually works is the students who have a lot of outside options, which tend to be the more well-off students, they're the ones the institutions are lusting after to try to recruit. And the people who end up getting the short end of the stick are the people who don't have a lot of outside options. Those are
Mm.
typically going to be in-state students, and they're the ones where tuition has been going up, and especially student loan repayment has been going down.
Mhm.
So my view is you have to have uniform tuition in order to create neutrality on the part of institutions in terms of which students they want to enroll, or increase neutrality. They're not only going to be going after the wealthiest students. The other thing that's worth saying here is you would think that the free college proposal, for example, the ones that Warren and Bernie put out in the 2020 Democratic primary, you'd think that state higher education institutions would be some of their loudest supporters because it's offering a huge amount of federal money basically to reduce tuition. So it's like, why wouldn't you want that if you're a higher education institution? The fact is they all uniformly opposed it, and they are the reason why it died in the Biden administration. Even, in the Biden administration, it kind of trickled down to free community college, and they killed even
They killed
that.
that,
And the reason why is because the whole idea of free tuition and an entitlement to higher education takes away the institution's gatekeeping power, and the institution's gatekeeping power is what they sell to their plutocratic supporters on the board of trustees or among the donor community. So what the institutions want to be able to pick and choose who's allowed through our doors and who gets our degree. That is how they confer prestige upon themselves and upon their students. And that is why any given billionaire would want to be on the board of trustees, is because they can tell their friends at cocktail parties, I'm on the board of this super prestigious institution, or I'm on the board of this institution, and you will have heard of it because your perception of it is that its prestige is rising. The way that institutions' prestige rises is by enrolling a more elite student body. And all of that
me
is
pause to ask, your proposals for public colleges, right? You're trying to prevent the public college from becoming less public. You're
yeah.
not gonna touch necessarily the Swarthmores and the Yales
No,
and
no,
the
no.
pre-existing
We are
public.
going to touch them. It's a little
Okay.
subtext in the proposal, but basically, what it says in the proposal is everyone loses access to the federal student loan mechanism unless they unless they submit to the regulatory apparatus. And the regulation, for example, includes not having plutocrats on the board of trustees. So Yale wants access to the federal student loan program. They have to totally reconstitute themselves, not have their board made up of, the wealthiest Yale grads or whatever. And they have to enroll, they have to charge uniform tuition. So would Yale want to do that? I don't know how dependent they are on the federal student loan
Sorry,
program.
let me interrupt you, just ask. So
Yeah.
we're gonna have uniforms tuition, but there's still gonna be student loans federally from
Well, I
the
mean, so one, the uniform tuition that's an undergraduate thing. I mean,
yeah,
let me just be clear. The proposal says everyone gets one free undergraduate degree or technical qualification.
okay,
So the proposal says free. I said on this chat that I'm not like
okay,
a doctrinaire free. Free
mhm,
isn't the thing to insist on. To me, uniform tuition is the thing to
mhm,
insist on. And uniform is what's really threatening to the
right.
stratification in the higher education system. So Yale can still charge tuition to undergraduate as long as it's uniform. Graduate studies still has tuition associated with it, although we would cap that too, because if that, for example, if there's still a federal student loan program that's handing out degrees, we don't want them, or handing out loans, we don't want them to be handing out indefinite loans like that. In some ways, that is exactly the weak point of the federal tuition or federal student loan program that backs up tuition now, is even where you have some states restraining tuition growth at the undergraduate level and doing some version of free college, they're definitely pushing on the graduate tuition in order to make up the shortfall, and that's pushing a lot of loans onto the federal balance sheet that aren't ever going to be repaid.
Sorry,
So,
the cost is uniform for who? Is for every
so
student gets one.
when we've been talking about uniform tuition, that is among undergraduates attending a given institution. In the
Do colleges currently charge some students more than others?
Oh yeah, 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 and
I mean, not
that has been
official aid,
getting
but they
more.
offer different financial aid, right? There's a
Yes, exactly.
tuition
Yeah,
number. Okay, yeah,
financial aid is a form of price discrimination, tuition
okay, yeah,
discrimination among the
yeah.
student body, and the argument among the center left or centrist higher education policy establishment is that is progressive. We want more of that because what that means is higher tuition paid by the students with more ability to pay, and that enables us to offer more generous financial aid to poorer students. And that is just not how the higher education system works. The schedule of tuition as a function of parental income is getting steeper, especially at like state flagships. But what's happening on the other end is not, okay, we're using that excess tuition to fund generous financial aid packages for lower income students. It is, we are not admitting as many lower income students.
I see.
So the state flagships in some sense are going more in the direction of what the, say, Ivy League or, well endowed private institutions have been doing for a while, which is they say, we have a very progressive tuition schedule because we offer generous financial aid. We just don't actually admit any poor people. And that is where the state
And
flagships
the
have been
uniform
happening from.
cost would have to be fairly low. So if you
Yeah,
don't,
yeah, yes,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
In my world, I mean, the 5,000 that you said, it's like that. That's I mean, 5,000 is higher than
yeah.
poor students pay in the status quo for state kind of mid-tier institutions, but it's, I mean, I don't know, it's probably about average actually. The state flagships are at higher tuition, including for poor students. So
Okay.
we would basically say everyone pays a uniform cost across the board, or uniform tuition across the board. What that does is hopefully generate this pooling equilibrium where the name over the door doesn't matter as much. Most institutions are, offering comprehensive programs to a wide variety of students, and you go to your local university, you're not necessarily trying to go to the most prestigious university or the one that will offer you the, kind of most tailored financial aid package.
So let's move to your second idea: system integration and desegregation. Build geographically delimited systems, but interlinked institutions that are serving heterogeneous student bodies. So the ideal in your mind is a college has lots of different kinds of students of incomes and wealth backgrounds and so on. And we're moving away from that. That's an important
Yeah,
core point of this, is that where you went to college is not a symbol for all these other things if the colleges are actually fairly diverse and I mean that in 1,000 ways, right?
yeah, yes. A thousand ways is an important point to make. I guess to kind of throw out even more economics jargon here, I already talked about pooling equilibria and separating equilibria on this call. Another form of jargon would be we propose horizontal differentiation, and the current reality is vertical differentiation. So in economics world, vertical differentiation means some products are better than others. The better
Mm,
product has higher prices. The richer people buy the better product at the higher price. The poor people buy the worst product at the lower price.
right.
That's the higher education system that currently exists. We don't like it.
It's like cars and
Horizontal,
everything else. We don't
yeah,
want that. Right. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
The horizontal differentiation might be, okay, your state public higher education system might have a liberal arts college, and it might have a large research campus, and it might have sort of a teaching focused 4-year institution in it, but those things are all accessible to all types of students. So like a student who wants a liberal arts
Oh,
education
I
can go
see.
to the liberal arts one, but that doesn't mean that they're of lower status than the people who go to the research one. Like that's the idea. Is there's value in differentiation in the higher education system, but that differentiation should not be about sorting students by background or by their income. It should be sorting students by their interests and their own tastes in what they would want out of a higher education system.
In other words, there could be a new school or whatever the thing in
Yeah.
Florida was, and there
Yes.
could
Yes.
be a
Exactly. Yeah.
research. There should
Yeah.
be an engineering school that's more
Yeah.
focused on math and science. But those
Right.
things would not it would not be the best students or
Yeah.
really the richest students are at one. Is what you're getting
Yes.
at, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, our proposal be funded by ending underwater lending. We get into that a little bit. Uh, but talk about the funding. How does this fit? Talk about the funding and how this will work. Yes.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, my assessment is federal government's originating $100 billion of student loans every year, of which 70% is not going to be repaid. So the biggest source of funding in our proposal is 7 billion or 70 billion of new student loans that instead would be allocated toward direct institutional funding, as we've already talked about. So that's already, I mean, when you look at the numbers in the free college proposals from the late 2010s, that's the ballpark we're talking about. That is to say, it's not a huge outlay. And it's certainly not. And the point I would make is this underwater student lending is due to tuition inflation on the part, or partly due to tuition inflation on the part of institutions. So the federal government, the key question that always kills progressive policy proposals supposedly is how you're going to pay for it. And my argument is we're already paying for it through this
Right.
underwater student lending. So there's no new money there. The other big source of funding that we propose that takes us up to just over 100 billion is the overhead on federal research grants. So as I said, the federal research agencies, NIH, National Science Foundation, climate research through NASA, NOAA, I think, and Department of Defense. All of those, provide this 50% on top of any grant toward the infrastructure of the university. We would separate that money from the research grant. So they're still funding research. Research is still important, and the federal government should be funding it. We have proposals on how to reform that too, but basically sever that overhead and put that in the pot that goes in direct institutional appropriations. And the reason there is because tying the overhead money to researchers creates a stratified political economy within higher education. The institutions are trying desperately to recruit the sort of top flight scientists that bring in those $1 million research grants from the feds, because that money comes along with the overhead, and that's what keeps the lights on. If the institution's getting that money other than through the recruitment of top scientists, then the idea is there's more egalitarian uh, 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 wage distribution, you could say, within higher education itself. So there's a whole section of the paper that's about dismantling the academic 1% and
Mhm.
rebuilding the academic middle class. The academic middle class, in my mind, is basically the tenured professoriate, which is a dwindling share of all of the academic labor. We have adjunctification and other forms of proletarianization and deprofessionalization of most academic labor. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the 1% of
Right.
people that are pulling down, high six-figure salaries because they bring in this research, the overhead funding that the universities need. So that kind of plutocratic political economy within higher education would be solved basically by severing the institutional aid uh, from the research overhead. So
I
those are the
wonder.
two big sources of money. And then, as I said earlier, also the economics don't work if the states withdraw funding or try to, avoid like the big concern in the 2010s was maintenance of effort on the part of the states. Like, if the feds up their funding of higher education, how do we know the states aren't just going to reduce it? And that's obviously been an issue in federal policy before. So we have some proposals in the paper to basically prevent that from happening as well. So we could get into that if you want, but that's basically the financial architecture of it.
Now that I this yeah, when you talked about universities and grants, it reminded me of how and NIH is. So it reminds me of how much of the crisis right now feels like the Trump administration is cutting off federal grants to these researchers, and therefore these universities are losing a lot of money. But I want to talk about partly you emphasize that you want to have a sort of a bigger role for the federal government in higher education than we and I think a lot of people right now, particularly people who are New Republic listeners or readers, are thinking, "Dear God, is he wants Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and that whole team doing more in higher education." So, kind of reconcile that for me a little bit about how right now someone who is not a Trump person would support a larger role for the federal government in higher education.
Yeah, I mean, the baseline argument is what enables the current Trumpian assault on the higher education system is the loss of trust among the broad public and many key stakeholders going back over decades.
Okay.
And so the federal re-involvement or the strengthening of the federal role in higher education is meant to restore the public's trust. And what we argue is basically you need to do that if you want to reform higher education in a pro-social direction. So the alternative is exactly what you enumerated, which is, I think, a lot of the sort of center-left or centrist higher education policy establishment is coming forward with. We need to take the politics out of medical research, and with the way that we do that is by separating the higher education system even more from the federal government. And the fact is that is nothing more than a slogan, because for all the reasons I've given, the system is totally dependent on the federal government. That's why
Mhm.
the Trump administration has been able to throw its weight around so much.
Mhm.
So I don't think any of those people that are saying we need to separate medical research from politics and take the wokeness out or whatever as a means of saving higher education, they're not proposing like a huge increase in state appropriations to higher education or levying new taxes in order to support it other than through the federal system. They're just saying, like, rhetorically, the problem here is that the wokesters polluted the image of higher education, and that alienated the plutocrats, and we need to bring the plutocrats back on board by
Mhm.
basically crushing the wokesters even more. So it's like, that's the kind of criticism of higher education you would get from Silicon Valley or something like that.
Right, right.
Kind of replaced excellence. That's their new
Right, right.
kind of buzzword is, we replaced excellence with wokeness or whatever, however they want to
Whatever. Right, right.
characterize it. And like with that is the problem. So we need to kind of side with Silicon Valley there and say, yes, we are restoring excellence. We're doing the most cutting edge medical research in the world. You shouldn't be touching that with your ideological agenda. Instead, leave that be. Don't interfere. And that it makes sense if your constituents are Silicon Valley billionaires. It makes sense that you would argue that point, but I don't think it is a very it's not going to carry a lot of weight when it comes to the politics of higher education, because that is tailored to a very narrow constituency, and the much broader constituency is thinking, I just want my kid to go to the local university and have a good education there, and not be paying back the student loans for the rest of their life, and have it ruin their lives. Like, that's all I want, and that constituency is served by a more egalitarian system, not a more stratified one.
Let me move to the fourth point. I think it's an important one, the labor reform, because I think part of what is going on here is that the way you want to protect academics who have thoughts that maybe the political establishment doesn't want is not getting the politics out of education, because you probably can't do that. Your
Yeah.
solution is to make sure the professors, faculty have real protections. So if they say something on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever the center left or more broadly Republicans don't like, that they have
Mhm.
labor. The way to protect academic freedom is not getting all federal role out of education. We're never going to do that,
Mhm.
but is to have real protections for the people who work in higher education.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's been no greater protection than solidarity on the part of academic labor so far. And there's a lot more upside, that's like they haven't not by any stretch of the imagination hit the ceiling of solidarity among higher education labor. So, like, no one's going to save us other than ourselves is my ethos when it comes to, the assaults on academic freedom. And also, I think for all of its uh, flaws, the professoriate is basically and I should say academic workers more broadly are the stakeholder that has the greatest uh, kind of motive to make the higher education system egalitarian and broadly accessible. That is to say, if you're looking at administrators, they're trying to do the opposite, to stratify their institutions in order to appeal to plutocrats, because they think that their saviors are going to be, $1 billion or billionaire donors who endow new centers or whatever, and like that's how they'll save themselves. And state legislators, basically like they only want the institution that they think glorifies themselves, and that their supporter. I mean, basically, I see state legislators as being, broadly at this point subservient to the plutocrats on the board and not to the broader state population. They're not interested in providing a public good to the people of their state. Like, there's just a very few public officials who have stood up for an egalitarian private higher education system. So when it comes to like what of the existing higher education constituencies are the ones that serve the public interest most, it is definitely the academic workers operating in solidarity. I mean, I would say, my own perspective is like, especially the ones that don't enjoy the institutional protections that were available in an earlier era. Like, there is definitely a generational divide among academic workers, where you have the older generation is like, let's keep what we have, let's fight like hell to kind of defend ourselves against this assault from all of our enemies, where and in my view, without recognizing the broad public loss of trust. It's just like, and I also think that comes from an earlier generation, frankly, of progressive politics, which imagines itself as minoritarian, and that the broad public is opposed to us because they're more conservative than we are. We are the righteous,
Right.
more elite, and our job is to sort of protect the public from their own bad political instincts, which is to side with the right. That has definitely not served academia very
Mhm.
well, and I also just don't think it's true that the academia doesn't have the support of the broad public. I think it would if it offered a quality product. And the problem with the status quo is that it doesn't, and we're deluding ourselves, and we think we should just sort of cling to what we have and try to defend it against all of its hostile actors.
We've glanced at this a few times. You talk about democratic governance of universities a lot. I think the story of like how involved these boards are, that I don't think that came out a lot during the the repression of the
Yeah.
Palestinian protests, how active these boards are at the private schools, but also, so talk about what, 'cause I think it's obvious that private schools have these rich people who will
Mhm.
give lots of money and are put on the board because they get lots of money. Explain how public schools have some of the same dynamics where the board is unrepresentative and dominated by plutocrats as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's frankly not any different
Okay,
because,
there it is.
for all the reasons we've already talked about, the public institutions in name have really privatized. So, like, what a constituency are they trying to serve? Well, that is, at least more, if not plutocratic, like definitely a more socioeconomically advantaged population. And then when you're talking about lower tier institutions, they're trying to appeal to local employers. So that's who's on the board.
Mm.
So it's like, okay,
Mhm.
your role is to educate our future workforce, and you better do that according to my dictates and not equip them to go get a job somewhere else other than in my workforce. So how does it happen? I think basically, for the same reason it happens in the private sector, you have, investors, so to speak, donors in this case, want representation and control over the institution they're supporting. So as these university systems have become more dependent, or less dependent on state appropriations, or the state appropriations are now conditional on getting funding from other sources, the administrations have gone around with the hat in hand trying to collect donations. One, we live in a plutocratic society anyway, so it's like, who
Right.
has the money? They're not, when they collect donations, they're not collecting a couple $100 from random alumnus who has broad, warm, fuzzy feelings towards the place they went to college 20 years ago. They're going to the people with the money, which is to say billionaires.
Right.
And when billionaires give money, they give obviously a lot more per call,
Donation.
but they also demand more control. Like the
Right.
person who's giving a couple $100 because they have warm, fuzzy feelings towards their alma mater, they're not asking to be on the board. It's like maybe they want a look at their kid or something like that. But like even
Right.
that is, it seems kind of like old fashioned to think that's their motivation at this point. The plutocrats, they want to be represented on the board. They want to control the institution. And as I said earlier, at a cocktail party where they're talking to other plutocrats, when they say, "Oh, I'm on the board of X university," they want their interlocutor to hear that and think, "Oh, that is a university that I perceive has
Mm.
risen in status and in prestige. So it reflects well on you that you are on the board of it." So that is the dynamic that kind of brings the plutocratic interest to bear on, what was once a public institution. And the plutocratic interest is very much on, gatekeeping access to the ruling class, in my opinion. Like basically the reason why higher education politics is so fraught and in the way that I see it is, no matter what, it controls the intergenerational access to the ruling class. Like, basically social reproduction happens through higher education, no matter what the higher education system looks like. So either you have social reproduction that is relatively egalitarian because people from non-traditional elite backgrounds can get access to the elite through the higher education system, or you have social reproduction that is completely plutocratic because a ruling class rigidly reproduces itself generation after generation. And a more plutocratic higher education system is going to have the latter context where plutocrat sits on the board, runs the institution in a way that they think they and their friends would want their children to be educated, and mostly that involves excluding people that should not be the peers of their children. And that is basically what the system that currently exists is designed to do.
All right, so ruling class is a little tough to define. Like, let's play this out. Let's personalize it a little bit. I don't recall where you went to college. I've forgotten now. You can share that or not. Okay, I went to Yale, and I think that's relevant in this conversation only because I think a lot of the people and I until recently was a columnist at the Washington Post, and I'm at the New Republic. I think a lot of the people who populate elite institutions in America are, let's call it part of the ruling class for now. A lot of those people, if you go to Congress, for example, look at the senators and House members. Those people disproportionately went to 10 or 15 colleges that are very elite and so on. So I think just thinking through this a little bit, I guess part of it is like my dad did not have a college degree, et cetera. So there's a my parents were not wealthy at all. So my mom got her BA 3 months before I did. But anyway, the point being that that's unusual for Yale, though.
Yeah.
I think the point is that these universities have our college education system has allowed a few more people in than it did in
Mhm.
1950. There's
Mhm.
more black students at Yale than in
Mhm.
1950, but in general, it's still reproducing these inequalities, which you're getting at, right? That's the
Yeah.
broad. Even if it has some social assess, even as it's doing some redistribution, it's in general entrenching the economic divides we had before.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely broadly think that if you look back at the higher education system that existed at the end of World War II, and compared it to the system that exists now, I don't know which one is more stratified. We definitely had less stratification between the end of World War II and the end of the 1960s through a variety of means. There's the GI Bill from the feds and more generous research funding from the feds. We also had state appropriations that were really designed to vastly expand systems to newly well-educated state population. So it's like what's called the high school movement. So the sort of universalization of high school education is a broad phenomenon from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. The demand for more higher education at the state level is like a phenomenon of the interwar period. I mean, to some degree, it predates this, but in terms of a mass higher education phenomenon, it's an interwar phenomenon. And then what happened after the war is the sense that, like, okay, well, we've expanded the system, but it's too disorganized. There's too many different types of institutions and they're doing different things. We need to standardize it to some degree, but do that in an egalitarian fashion. So throughout the 20th century, there's basically been a fight within higher education policy that is like, the system's too disorganized. We need to make it more well constructed and efficient. But exactly how do we do that? By making it more stratified, or do we do that by making it less stratified? In the post-war era, less stratified won out for a brief period of time. My view is basically it ended with the backlash against campus protests in the 1960s that was viewed by the ruling class as being, the sort of end result of the New Deal and civil rights movement, kind of creating a threat to the social order that was ultimately out of control and had to be put down. And so you had this, kind of elite consensus between, what you might think of as the elite center left and the elite center right in the late 1960s and early 70s to convert away from institutional funding towards student debt as a means of disciplining the student body and getting the faculty under control, because all those people definitely did not like what they perceived as an overly radical faculty that had too much job security. So between those things, that elite consensus is what created the higher education system that we have now. And as you described it, it's like who you can tell what kind of institution someone is going to go to by their socioeconomic background, and vice versa. For a given institution, you can make a pretty, if I tell you so-and-so is a student at some institution, you can make a very good guess about what their socioeconomic background is on the basis of that information. So that institutional stratification, this is where we started this conversation, that is what I perceive as the signature quality of the higher education system that currently exists.
And your point is that something is stratified like this is inevitably going to be unpopular, and not with the
right.
It's hard
Exactly.
to imagine a very stratified thing that has
these beautiful universities, and everyone says, "Oh, we have the best higher education system in the country." I mean, that like I really, or sorry, in the world, that defense against Trump, it's like, how could you destroy this beautiful creation that is a credit to our country? I just I gag or vomit whenever I hear that.
You mean that the Harvard people are saying don't destroy Harvard or Yale,
or even the University of Michigan or the University of Utah, where I teach, for that matter. It's like, this is so great because it is world class and supposedly does all this groundbreaking research that is a credit to this country that powers our economy and attracts students from overseas. Like, yeah, all of those things are true, and that is an aspect of the higher education system that's worth defending. But what I imagine most Americans hearing when they hear the phrase, "this is the best higher education system in the world," is one, okay, well, my kid's not going there or doesn't have access to the best ones. They have access to a defunded state institution that's no longer offering an academic education. Or alternatively, they got charged through the nose. They're still paying off their student debt, and that's the best system in the world. It's like, that ruined my life. That didn't give me the economic status and middle class security that I expected from it. In fact, that screwed me over. So I really think trying to defend the system by saying how great it is a wrong path. Definitely not what a majoritarian political movement would use to defend that system that exists.
The reason I mentioned where I went to school and so on was, I think part of what I was trying to get in and I failed to was not to brag on myself, but to say that the problem is the people who benefited from the system are in the jobs describing the system. And
Yeah.
like I remember
Yep.
when
Yeah. Yeah.
student loan was, it's hard to get a bunch of Yale graduates to say the system is stratified
Yeah.
and entrenching our power, because why would they say that? And
Yeah.
so part of it is like, who would they who in actual the broad public and the people who attend these defunded colleges don't get a chance to speak very often in
Yeah.
forums that matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with that. It's a huge weakness of the sort of higher education policy establishment that has tried to defend the system from Trump, about how elitist it is, for the reason that you're saying. Their experience of higher education is, this is what put me in the job, that in the high status job that I have. It's because I got a master's of public policy or whatever at some, the Kennedy
Kennedy
School
School.
at Harvard or something like that, or I went to Yale Law School. And it's like that is what gives me identity. So like, you're coming after the institution that I
Right.
place all of my identity in. And it's like, well, that is not the higher education system that actually exists. And as you say, the people who have to deal with that higher education system don't get heard in the halls of power. And then the other aspect of that, this is who's defending it, is the people who benefited from it, is exactly like, they're going to say, okay, well, protect my thing, like protect the thing that I like. So they're going to kind of keep chopping off aspects of the system that exists and kind of throwing them to the wolves to protect the thing that they care about. And meanwhile, what they've chopped off is the thing that the public actually had an interest in preserving. And so now those people have betrayed what should be their public constituency.
So what's next? Finish up here. What is next for this kind of you get this big broad idea of like really changing the higher education system in really fundamental ways that I think, as you acknowledge, a lot of people who consider themselves Democrats and maybe liberals do not agree with. So where do you go from here? This idea of we need a different system with the federal government is involved, but in a different way than it has been before. How do you I'm not even sure Elizabeth Warren would support these ideas right now. How do you build the system to make this to move this thing?
So, I mean, really, the motivation for embarking on this project to begin with, which is absolutely not over by any stretch of the imagination. This is like the first, I mean, I've been studying these subjects for like a decade now, and, that's only the beginning. I plan to spend the rest of my life on this kind of thing. It is because in the fight over student debt cancellation, well, student debt in general, and then as it kind of morphed into cancellation specifically as a policy proposal toward the end of the 2010s, I felt was too kind of focused on student debtors as the victims of, like, or not victims, not quite the right word, because that is how I see them. It's more like the sort of sympathetic, kind of like downtrodden that we elite have to help and lift up by the boots, or lift up from above. And moreover, the criticism then was like, okay, well, if you cancel the student debt, that's your policy proposal, aren't we just going to have to do it again in 10 years after more student debt is accumulated?
That
And I
was
do think
legitimate,
that,
yes.
yeah, I think that is a legitimate criticism. So that both of those two, kind of uh, uh, concerns that I had coming out of the sort of last round of higher education policy war speaks to the need for alternative vision from the left that gives people a chance to rally around. Again, I don't like that the centrist elites are so focused on the system is good. Why are you attacking this good system? Or at least the part of the system that educated me is good. Why are you attacking that part? Let's sacrifice something else to preserve it. That just isn't like the public wants to be educated. They want access to a high quality, reasonably priced higher education, and we have to give it to them. And that is what the policy proposal is trying to do. So if you're asking sort of concretely, what do I plan to do with it? Well, I'm hoping that political candidates would say, would be asked, like, okay, do you support this proposal or elements of this proposal? I think a big cleavage, as this conversation has already alluded to in the pretty near future, is like, do you want to get the federal higher education further separated from the federal government, or do you want the federal government to take ownership of the system that they're funding and improve its quality? So I think that, regardless of the exact details of what's in the proposal, I think that cleavage is going to be very central to, say, the way this is talked about in midterm election or next Democratic presidential primary round. So that is a big motivation for putting it out there. I also think it is, aside from candidates going around and being asked, what's your higher education policy agenda? And hopefully they'll say, oh, that paper, I like that paper. That's my agenda. Is just the public demanding that of state legislators. So, not so much on the political campaign, but like at present, when higher education administrators and regulators go before the state legislature and are grilled about wokeness and run amok on campus, they basically have nothing to say that, in my view, is healthy towards the long-term interests of the higher education system,
They
what
will
they're
either
saying is,
concede the point or
yeah,
say we have intellectual diversity and start counting Republicans.
yeah,
They
yeah,
aren't
yeah,
they're not
exactly,
helpful.
exactly.
Yeah,
None of that is a robust defense of the actual system. So, in my
right.
view, this is a robust defense of the system, and it is both. It is a vision that both, at least in theory. I mean, I don't imagine plutocrat-dominated board of trustees are going to get behind this vision anytime soon. But like, you could imagine some higher education administrators looking at this and saying, "This is what I'm going to say we're doing at my campus, and why it should be funded by the state legislatures because we are actually providing a high quality education to the people of the state." Alternatively, it's the kind of thing that in the hands of the state legislator of, I'm imagining a pro-social, not necessarily the most left-wing state legislature, but someone who wants to be seen as creating a public good, fostering a public good for the people of their state. They would have this proposal in front of them and question the regulators and the higher education administrators that are in front of them at hearings and say, well, why are you trying to recruit, why are you trying to recruit out of state in order to make up tuition? That has been the kind of thing that state legislators are pressuring flagship public institutions to do in the past. And I mean, to some degree, there are some state legislators that have kind of put
Right.
arbitrary caps on that, but also not funded the institution. So it's kind of like they're tying the hands of the administrators, kind of, because that is a populistic seeming thing to do. The whole point is this proposal hangs together as a comprehensive agenda. So it is the kind of thing that could motivate a progressive-minded state legislator to kind of take up and champion as, I'm going to build a higher education system that actually serves the interests of the people who live in the state. And that involves not recruiting out of state. It involves not trying to get the best researcher that brings in the most federal grant money and kind of subordinating the whole institution to that. It involves providing a affordable, high quality education to everyone in the state who cares to want it, regardless of their background.
I want to ask one final question. We got to go at two. You got to go. You need to go.
No, no, no. I'm good. I'm
I
good.
want to ask one final question, which is like,
Yeah.
I hate when this happens. This is happening all the time now, where Democratic politician X, who made sure to get their kid, who went to a fancy school, or made God sure that their kids went to UPenn, or that's a good example because Joe Biden, State College X, all his kids went to so they go out of their way to say, but what they often say is everyone shouldn't go to college. College
Yeah.
is not for everyone. Can we address this sort of head on here? I
Yeah.
agree that college is not for everyone, but they're not really saying that. They're
Yeah.
really saying we want to make sure college is for everyone who wants to go, not everyone whose parents think they
Yeah.
should be there.
Yeah, and I mean, I would further point out, I mean, it's especially galling for me to hear that now from exactly the type of politician who 20 years ago was saying everyone should go to college
Right.
because that is how you get into the middle class, and the college earnings premium is so high that we imagine, if anyone goes to college, basically any amount of student debt, any amount of tuition is worth paying for
Mhm.
it because the college earnings premium is so enormous. Now, that exact same politician or type of politician is saying, no, 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 not everyone should go to college because it sounds populistic to say, oh no, I support trade school or whatever.
Right.
Like, and so
Which you and I
part of
support. Trade
yeah,
school.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I also like the trade school or the trade schoolification of the higher education system amounts to transferring the cost of job training onto students' shoulders. So it is
Mhm.
not, in fact, as we have already talked about, it's not in fact a kind of like pro working class message, at least in its in the reality of that. And I don't think politicians like what I would diagnose in this case is the politicians don't know what to say about higher education. They want to say something that doesn't sound so elitist and so woke. So they're saying, trade school, that's what I'm going to say. And I'm giving them something else to say that is, in my view, actually pro-social and would actually bespeak a progressive reform to the higher education system that is populistic, that isn't actually kind of serving the interests of employers as opposed to workers. So that's what I mean. That kind of person, yes, it pisses me off too. They are, in fact, saying, you shouldn't go to college. Only my kid should go to college. God forbid we actually have a higher education system that the broad public can access. I'm giving them, if they don't want to be caught saying that and being correctly interpreted by their audience to say the higher education system isn't for you, they can instead espouse the views and reforms that this paper puts out. Like, I am offering that to them in good faith, and they can take it up. It is now available to them. They can't say there's at least no other ideas on the table. I guess that's the best I can do is like I can make it the case that there are better ideas on the table, and it is on you if you don't espouse them.
A great conversation. I learned a lot. Marshall, tell people where they can find your ideas just generally, where you are on social and all the kinds of media, and then second, where they can find this specific proposal.
Yeah, so we sort of dived right into the substance of it without. I should have said up front. This paper is a joint publication of the Jain Family Institute, where I'm a senior fellow in higher education finance, as well as Higher Education Labor United, which is a coalition of union locals representing workers in various aspects of the higher education system. So it's pretty ecumenical in terms of faculty, academic staff, graduate students, different of the locals are kind of representing different aspects of the higher education workforce. But in any event, they have come together as a coalition in order to put proposals on the table exactly like this one that are kind of more responsive to, I think, the reality of the system that exists. So you can go to HELU's website, that is Higher Education Labor United, HELU. They have the paper on their website. It is also posted on my website, marshallsteinbaum.org. In terms of finding me more generally, as you've already
I've
said,
included
Perry.
a link here to the proposal if anybody wants to check it out. There's a
Yeah,
chat part. If you want to see that link, there's a link to Marshall's proposal. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. So as I said, as you introduced me, I'm a senior fellow in higher education finance at the Jain Family Institute. So we publish a lot of reports about student debt in particular, but some aspects that appear in this proposal over the years. So you can go to it's called Higher Education Finance is our little unit at the Jain Family Institute. You have my website is marshallsteinbaum.org if you're interested in my other academic work. We haven't touched on a whole swath of it, but if you really like reading academic papers, those are all on my website. I'm on Twitter at econ_Marshall.
And
And
I guess
yes,
I bring you up only to say there are economists that are not Larry Summers or Jason Furman who have thoughts that are not Larry Summers and Jason Furman, despite the media only calling these two
yeah,
people. Sorry.
yeah. Well, thank you very much, Perry. I'll end there. There, I am an economist who is not Larry Summers or Jason Furman. That is enough. That is all you need to know.
Good to see you, Marshall. Take care.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.